I'm Henny B, and welcome to the World War I Stories podcast, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. Some scenes in these stories may be too graphic for sensitive listeners, so listener discretion is advised. Today's episode, If the Water Can Find a Way. Mrs. Whitmore? She stared out the window, barely hearing the voice. Mrs. Whitmore, it came again. The sound reached her like a ghost, distant and faint, but she could not respond. She was too focused on what was happening just outside the one-room schoolhouse. She had seen kangaroos before. They were common in this part of Wattleford. She had seen them fight, too, but there was something about this clash that held her attention. The contrast between the two could not be overstated. One tall, the other short. One burly, the other wiry. The larger kangaroo leaned back on its tail, propping itself with strong forearms while its legs lashed out in powerful kicks. But the smaller one was quick, agile. Slipping past the blows, it twisted suddenly, and in that instant she saw it. The smaller roo was missing an arm. The larger roo faltered, shifting clumsily onto its legs. The smaller one seized the opening, spinning to the side and driving its hind legs into the big roo's head. The larger kangaroo toppled to the ground. With startling ferocity, the one-armed roo began to pummel its fallen opponent with its hind legs, also using its tail for balance. Mrs. Whitmore! The voice now was sharp, panicked, pulling her back into the room. She turned from the window. "What's that?" she asked the class. "Who called me?" Her schoolhouse held 12 children, from 7 to 14 years old. A small hand rose. She crossed to the boy, about 12, his blond hair untidy, his green eyes piercing. "Yes, Eugene, what is it?" He looked up, frustration in his eyes. "I just don't understand this problem." "Which one?" she asked. He pointed to the bottom of his slate-board. "Well, if you carry the one over here, it should make sense." She watched him work, then glanced again at the window. Both kangaroos were gone. "I wonder who won," she murmured louder than she intended. Eugene looked up. "Who won what?" Kangaroos were fighting." "Oh." He bent back over his slate as if it were nothing. "One had one arm." Eugene looked up again. "We've seen him before. We call him Louis." No longer listening, she walked back to the window and peered out. "I wonder if that's what the war looks like. I hope my boys are all right," she thought. Josie sat across from her at the table, just as he had every evening for the past 23 years. Tonight she had made meat pie with a flaky crust filled with minced meat and rich gravy, served with mashed potatoes and green peas. The house was quiet, broken only by the steady song of crickets drifting in through the open window. The savory aroma of the pie mingled with the fresh scent of eucalyptus carried on the cool night breeze from the bushland beyond. An oil lamp glowed softly between them, its light mixing with the fading sun just outside their window. As she looked at Josie this night, she saw something she did not always see in him. Their sons. Tonight, in this light, in this frame of mind, she saw each of her sons in his face as he sat quietly taking bites of his meat pie. He looked up from his plate and glanced at her. She saw his smile. It was Ned's smile. She saw his tender eyes. That was Jamie. In one moment, she saw 3 men in one. "Eleanor, are you okay, my love?" She felt a tear emerge from her eye and used her napkin to dab it. "I miss the boys." He put his fork down and reached his hand across the table to take hers. "I miss them too," he said. "It's a ridiculous war over there, and for a king a world away. I just want them to come home." "Me too. I wish they hadn't had to go, but sadly, with things the way they are, it's their duty. She smiled and giggled. Remember when Ned got his head stuck between the porch railing? He threw out a hearty laugh. Ah, yes, because Jamie dared him and told him that he could get an extra scone if he did it. Jamie was always the devious one, she added, while still chuckling. Well, Ned is not innocent either. Do you remember when he dared Jamie to climb the tree near the schoolhouse to chase the koala? Oh my goodness, he fell from the tree and broke his arm. And the koala was untouched. He shook his head as he laughed. Her expression straightened. This home feels so empty without them. The tears flowed freely now. She let herself go. Josie stood, walked around the small table, and stood behind her. He held her as she cried. She relished their early Sunday walks, both to church and home. It was these walks in which the boys would go on about their weeks, school, the shenanigans they would get into, the nature around them, and just life in general. She and Josie learned about Ned and Jamie this way. Now it was just she and him, husband and wife, two middle-aged people who discussed the sermon and enjoyed each other's company for the 2-mile walk. The afternoon air was brisk. They quietly talked about the sermon as they walked hand in hand. The familiar scenery that surrounded them often brought forth memories about the boys that she brushed away, for if she didn't, she would cry again. They walked along a path that ran adjacent to Wattleford Creek. The waterway for which the town was named was only 4 feet wide and maybe ankle deep, but it stood as an important symbol to the people of Wattleford, a symbol of resilience, one that said no matter what obstacles emerge, if the water can find a way, so could they. In the distance she could see a man and a woman. She sat on the ground next to the creek watching it flow, as he sat in what looked like a wheelchair doing the same. Probably an older man and his caretaker, she thought to herself. As they grew closer to the pair, she then noticed that this was not an older man at all. He was quite young. In fact, he was about Ned and Jamie's age, and he was in uniform. Her mind raced as she and Josie walked past. Had he been to France? What was it like there? Could he tell her? Her curiosity made it hard to listen to Josie as he rambled on about the preacher's words that morning. She stopped in her tracks, which in turn made Josie stop mid-step. Eleanor, is everything okay? She did not answer. She dropped his hand, and without really thinking or even a plan, she turned and made her way to the couple sitting by the creek. The couple sat in silence as she approached. Clearing her throat to announce her presence, they both looked at her. "Good day," she started nervously. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore." The woman responded first. Her smile was genteel and warm. She was younger, probably about 18 or 19 years old. Her golden hair was layered in curls. She stood lifting the hem of her flowered dress. "Clara Davies, this is my brother Arthur." Arthur turned his head towards her and looked up, attempting a smile, but she could tell it was just for show. She returned the smile, and that's when she noticed the large scar that ran from the top of his scalp, past his left eye, and down his face to his neck. Her hands instinctively went to her mouth. "Oh my goodness!" His face changed. He looked away, seemingly ashamed. Ashamed herself, she walked around his wheelchair and stood in front of him, then slowly got to her knees to be at eye level. "I'm so sorry, Arthur. I hope you can forgive me." "Don't be sorry. It's something I'll have to get used to." Tears filled her eyes. She glanced at Clara. Her eyes were glossy as well. Josie stood nearby, passive but paying attention. Her attention back on the young man, she spoke again. "My sons are in France. Maybe Belgium. I don't know for sure." "What are their names?" Arthur asked. Ned and Jamie. She paused. Whitmore. Ned and Jamie Whitmore. I went to school with those boys, but I never saw them in France. Not where I was, anyhow. An awkward silence fell between them as Eleanor tried to form her next question in her head. She did not want to look selfish in front of this boy that was now most likely a shell of his former self. "What's it like over there?" she finally asked quietly. "I don't want you to relive details. I just want to feel like my boys are okay." "Ma'am, with all due respect, nobody over there is okay. Not in my book, anyways." "That's what scares me," she said quietly. His eyes softened and he reached an arm out to put on her shoulder. "I can't sugarcoat this, ma'am, no matter how much I wish to." She looked into his eyes. They were the eyes of a man that was once innocent and was now scarred. "I don't want you to." By now, both Clara and Josie had sat on the creek bank, where they both glared off into the distance, pretending not to listen. "You get used to the shelling. That happens day and night over there. You get used to keeping your head down, and the rifle fire. The rats are huge and disgusting, but you get used to those too." "Is there anything that you don't get used to over there?" she asked quietly. "I learned not to make any friends over there. Sooner or later, they all end up dead, missing, or in with the surgeons getting pieces of them removed." She let out a loud gasp at that revelation, and she could tell that he noticed. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. "Like I said, I cannot sugarcoat this." "It's quite all right," she said as a tear rolled down her cheek. "I stayed to myself, mostly because whenever we went over the top, there was a bunch of us that stayed over the top, in no man's land. I didn't want to get close to anybody." "That sounds terrible," he interrupted. "It is terrible. It's a lonely existence for some of the guys over there. Some don't even get letters from home." "Is it all fighting all the time?" she asked. "No, mostly it's waiting, listening to the shelling, feeling the ground shake beneath you, wading through the water in the trenches. For some reason, no matter what we did, the bottoms were always flooded." "That sounds miserable." They sat there for a moment in silence, he looking at the slowly flowing creek, and she at the ground. "Socks," he whispered. "I'm sorry, what was that?" she asked him. "Socks. Of all the things we ever needed the most over there, it was socks. So many guys got sent home because their feet were always wet. They call it trench foot." "Trench foot?" she asked. "What's that?" "It's when your feet stay wet for too long," he said. "The skin starts to rot, turns black, and the pain." He stopped, looked towards the creek again. Some of the boys couldn't walk after a while. Some lost their feet altogether. Eleanor's hand went to her chest. "All because of wet feet?" He nodded. "All because of wet feet." There was more silence between them before he broke it again. "When I was over there, the one thing I wanted the most, I could never have. That was food from home. What they serve us over there is meant to give us energy, not to satisfy our taste buds, you know." "I do wish I could send my boys some food," she mentioned. "They and every other soldier would love that." She rose to her feet and prepared to leave him and his sister to their solitude. "Thank you for talking to me, Arthur." He looked up at her. "I hope your boys come home, ma'am. I really do." She was overcome by an impulse, and she took it. She bent over and gave him a hug, then a light kiss on the cheek. She turned to Clara. "I wish to invite you two for dinner next Sunday, after church service." Clara smiled. "I would love that." She turned to Arthur. "Arthur, would it be okay if we went to dinner next Sunday after church?" Eleanor watched Arthur smile for the first time. That would be nice. She watched as Clara's attention focused on something behind her, something on the other side of the creek. Her look was one of curiosity mixed with wonder. Eleanor turned her head to look. Clara spoke almost to herself. That Rue only has one arm. How fascinating. Eleanor smiled at the sight of seeing the Rue again. The kids call him Louis. The schoolhouse was dark and empty the next morning when she entered. It would be an hour or more before the students arrived. She emptied out the box she had brought with her, the items that she had scavenged around her home. She had found 4 pairs of wool socks, undergarments, a few books, and some dried dates as well as figs. The clothing had belonged to her boys. She did not care. They could get more if they came home, she thought. Deep down, though, she knew that if a person needed socks and neither Jamie or Ned had extra, they would gladly give them up. She sat and waited. She wondered if she should have prepared a lesson plan for the day, since she had not. No, she decided. They can spend the day reading books if necessary. As the children began to arrive, some overtired, some wide awake and boisterous, she felt an excitement wash over her. After a few minutes, when the children were all seated, she stood before them. In one hand she held a pair of socks, and in the other, a book. Children, as you all may know, there is a war in Europe. I have 2 sons fighting there now. A hand shot up. It was a little girl, all of 7 years old, also named Eleanor, but had been nicknamed Ellie. Yes, Ellie. My father says the king is evil for sending people from Australia. Is that true? Ellie asked. Well, Ellie, that's a question for others, not for me, sweetheart, but I thank you for the question. She continued with her thoughts. Yesterday, I met a man named Arthur. He just returned from the war. Do any of you know Arthur and Clara Davies? She gave it a few moments, but none of the children responded to the question. Odd for such a small town, she thought. I was speaking to Arthur, and he was telling me what it was like over there. Now, I will spare you children from the details. She looked at the older children in the room. You older kids can see me in private and ask if you wish. 13 and older, I mean. She held up the pair of socks and the book and continued on. I would like you all to ask your parents to gather up items that are of no use to them anymore. Items our boys can use. Socks, books, dried foods, anything. I want to send them to our troops. An older boy named Henry, about 14, raised his hand. She looked at him and nodded. Henry? You're holding socks. Why socks? Henry asked. That's a great question, Henry. She took a moment to look at the socks herself. When you dig a hole for a fence post, what usually ends up at the bottom? Anyone? An 11-year-old named Andrew blurted out, Water! He said it excitedly. She smiled at him. That's right. It's what we call groundwater. Our boys are living in trenches dug into the ground. So what does that mean? Henry answered before Andrew could. Groundwater? She nodded in Henry's direction. Exactly, and our boys are walking in this water day and night. And when it rains or snows, it gets even worse. Dry socks are their direst need. Again, I do not wish to explain trench foot to the youngsters, but you older kids can feel free to ask me about it later. She let the words fall where they may. She knew that some of the children would not understand. They were too young, but she hoped that all of the children would be eager to help. I also would like all of us to write letters. My goal is to put packages together to send to the front. Packages with socks, food, and other items. And if we can include a letter, we just may make a soldier's day. She paused, letting her eyes scan the room of curious faces. "What do you all think of that?" She was disappointed as they walked to the church that Sunday. Not a single child brought in a single item, and all of the parents had forbid them from writing letters. She did not know why. On Monday, she had been so full of hope, so full of excitement, but on this Sunday, she was full of sadness. As a result, she and Josie walked in silence. Townspeople gathered outside the church, which was a normal activity just before the service. They often spoke in loud tones and laughed often as they described their weeks to one another. And that was what was happening now. As Eleanor and Josie approached, however, their neighbors glared at them and shifted to hushed tones. Eleanor hung her head low as they got closer and edged towards the chapel door. A man blocked their path. "What gives you the right to ask our children to help the king?" This was Frank Johnson. She had met him before. He was the father of Andrew. And with that one question, the small crowd of adults erupted into a cacophony of similar questions that overwhelmed her. "If you cannot see what she is trying to do for the boys that are fighting, then that's a you problem," exclaimed Josie, and he pushed Eleanor through the small crowd and towards the chapel doors. Once inside, they took seats near the back of the church. "Thank you," she said to Josie, and lightly kissed him on the cheek. Minutes later, people started to pile in. Most looked at her, all with a level of disdain in their eyes. Why, she wondered to herself, why are they so angry that she wished to help the boys overseas? Their reasoning made no sense to her. About 8 minutes passed as everyone got situated. Their row sat empty except for them. Then the pastor took to the dais. As he started to speak, the murmurs began. It was 2 people at first, then 4, then 6, and so on. Reverend Baskin was not 3 minutes into his service when a lady stood up in the middle pews. It was Mrs. Green. She was a younger woman with 2 children in Eleanor's school, Macy, who was 7, and Gregory, who was 9. "Yes, Mrs. Green," Reverend Baskin asked. "I'm sorry to interrupt, sir, but I think we as a collective have to talk about Miss Whitmore's project." She used air quotes as she said the word project in an attempt to emphasize it. Eleanor could see the Reverend take a deep breath before he spoke again. "Yes, I've heard. Many of you have complaints." "Yes, we have complaints," Mrs. Green added. Frank Johnson stood next. "She wants to send items to the front to help the king. I thought we in Australia wished to be rid of the monarchy, not assist it." Reverend Baskin put his hands up in a plea for silence, but the crowd had erupted in conversation about just how wrong Eleanor had been. She sat in silence listening, still not understanding, but listening still. If she could sink into the pew and disappear, she would. She had put her head in her hands as Josie put his arms around her. She heard a sound, a squeak. Everyone else must have heard it as well, for the church went silent. She lifted her head and glanced toward the aisle. It was Arthur. He was maneuvering his wheelchair down the aisle and towards the front. "No, Arthur, stop." It was Clara. She pushed herself past Arthur and to the front. She positioned herself at the dais and looked at Reverend Baskin until he capitulated and gave up the place where he stood. Eleanor was in shock. What was happening? Clara turned to face the congregation. Eleanor could see her hands trembling, but her voice was steady. "See that man?" she said, pointing to Arthur. "That's my brother. Does he look like the crown to you?" Arthur had positioned himself in the center of the aisle, the center of the church, and everyone could see him. "He left this town a year and a half ago. He was strong, healthy, and full of life. He came home with a scar down his face, legs that won't move, and nightmares that don't end. And you think helping boys like him means helping the king? Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. You all shame this woman for trying to send a bit of kindness to those who have nothing. Boys who are far from home, boys who are tired, cold, lonely. Boys who fear that any moment could be their last. Boys who have seen things they'll never be able to forget. She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice softened. Those boys don't care about politics. They don't fight for crowns or for kings. They fight because they were told to. They fight beside each other because that's all they have left. She pointed at Eleanor. This woman only wants to send them socks, food, and a few kind words. And you, she looked back to the congregation, you could do the same if you'd stop thinking about the damned crown for 1 minute and start thinking of them as sons, as brothers, as fathers. Silence again. Reverend Baskin lowered his head. Josie's arm tightened around Eleanor's shoulders. Arthur wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Clara exhaled, angry now. I know everyone in this room, and I know that only 3 boys have left this town to fight. My brother, Ned, and Jamie Whitmore. Not your sons, not your brothers, just ours. But look at your sons, look at your daughters. If they were there, would you still think that sending socks, books, food, and letters was for the crown? You could hear a pin drop in the room. I didn't think so. And in the silence, the congregation looked on as she stepped from the dais, walked down the aisle, turned Arthur's chair around, and walked out the door. Eleanor and Josie stood to follow. They had decided on an early dinner that evening. The sun was still high in the sky as she sat with Josie, Arthur, and Clara. Eleanor set the table carefully. Over the lamp's amber glow, she brought in bowls of steaming vegetable soup, followed by slices of sandwich pie, meat layered between soft bread and baked until golden. Alongside, she placed a dish of cheese and lentil savory, its warm aroma mingling with that of the fresh greens from the garden. They sat in silence, none of them daring to mention what had happened at church that morning. Eleanor, however, could not help herself but be proud of Clara, for she had betrayed a strength that Eleanor did not truly feel. It was Josie that broke the silence. Clara, I want to thank you for what you did back there. Clara blushed. It was nothing, really. No, he started. It was everything. You stood and did something that I couldn't even find the strength to do. You defended my wife. Eleanor grabbed his hand. You did too, when you pushed me through the doors. Don't forget that. Yeah, but I did not do what she did. She's a hero in my eyes. Arthur finally spoke. Mine too. Ever since I've been home, she's taken care of me. And now, she's fought, not for me, but for men she's never and will never meet. She is a hero. There was a knock at the door. Josie rose to answer, but before he could, the door burst open. It was Reverend Baskin. What's wrong, Reverend? Josie asked, confused. The Reverend walked past Josie and to Eleanor. It's the schoolhouse. You have to come now. Her hands went to her mouth. What's happened? Just come, he said frantically, and he started for the door. She looked at Josie. They both feared the worst. The schoolhouse was a half-mile away from their home and was nestled next to the creek that always seemed to find a way. As they crested the small hill that overlooked the school, she gasped. From the way the Reverend had spoken, she had expected to see the small building on fire, or destroyed pieces floating in the creek. Instead, what she saw made her eyes well up in tears. There were people everywhere, all holding items, books, bags of what looked like food, and more importantly, socks. She walked down the hill with Josie in tow. Clara pushed Arthur just behind them. Not a word was spoken as she unlocked the schoolhouse door. One by one, the residents of Wattleford, including Frank Johnson and Mrs. Green, paraded past her, arms full of goods for the troops. The afternoon sun was high in the sky as she stepped out of the Wattleford Postal Agency. The contents of the wagon she and Josie had borrowed from the church had been emptied. The townspeople had clearly been moved by Clara's words and at the sight of Arthur. A shopkeeper had donated boxes for the packages. The children, and even adults, had written letters. Reverend Baskin had spoken to military members in Adelaide and scheduled the shipping. It had become a team effort. Her emotions were beginning to break through, knowing that the packages were now being shipped. The tears threatened. Across the creek, from within a small concentration of trees, she saw movement. Louis, the one-armed Roo, emerged. He stopped and looked around, his gaze eventually stopping on her. She waved at him, knowing that he had no idea what it meant. "Good morning, Louis," she yelled. She watched as Louis approached the creek, lowered his head to drink, then hopped away back into the trees. You've been listening to World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. If this episode stayed with you, if it stirred something quiet or left you in stillness, share it, follow the show, leave a rating, help keep these stories alive. Our first collection now lives on Kindle. Search World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches, Volume 1 in your Kindle app, and carry these echoes with you. For glimpses behind the curtain and stories between the stories, join me on Instagram at WWIPod_HennyB. And if you'd like to see your name in the credits, become a producer. Visit our Patreon at patreon.com/World War I Stories and help power the next tale into existence. Thank you for walking back in time with me.